after the talk with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the phone, do you think President Trump has realized the realities of the issue on the ground here?
Well, I think it's very important for the United States and China to coordinate their approach. As President Xi and the Chinese diplomats have said, we need a coordinated approach involving sanctions pressure, but also engagement. And the United States has a very good approach that's similar to China's on paper, but the execution of the U.S. approach has been different. The U.S. has been emphasizing the pressure. There has not been sufficient engagement. I think this is a crucial time for President Xi to help persuade President Trump that in order to leverage the power of the sanctions, there needs to be effective, sustained diplomacy with North Korea designed to halt their further testing and eventually talk about denuclearization.
Mr. Zhao, of course, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also said, talking on the sideline, meeting his foreign counterpart, the half of the key is, let's just say, sanctions and other measures to be taken immediately. But he said the other half of the key is really dialogue and negotiations. But it seems that the United States have also been talking about half. For example, Ambassador Haley from the United States to the UN talking about half measures of diplomatic measures have to be finished. It has to exhaust all, as she said, the diplomatic means. How would you compare the ways of expressing things, and how is that reflecting the different views?
I think that really reflects the deep gap between the positions of Washington and Beijing. Washington really emphasizes on more coercive measures on North Korea, but China emphasizes on positive inducement for North Korea to come into the negotiating table. I've been observing the domestic discussions in the United States. I think the U.S. is still very reluctant to accept the reality that North Korea already obtained a credible nuclear capability. I think China has been trying very hard to persuade the United States to be more realistic, but so far has failed in most cases. But North Korea has been very successful to push and force United States to face the reality. If we compare the previous American positions to now, the American positions have greatly softened because North Korea has demonstrated greater and better capabilities. So I think after a little while, maybe U.S. ultimately will be persuaded by North Korea's increasing capabilities.
But at the same time, Mr. Zhao, before I go to the other guests, you also noticed that the Chinese President Xi Jinping on the phone talking to Angela Merkel, certainly a European leader, and both sides agree dialogue and negotiation is the way to go. And of course, both agree on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Why is China working so hard on different kinds of players? Is Europe and other players in the world also important in this regard, Mr. Zhao?
Yes, absolutely. The United States doesn't have the leverage over North Korea. It has to rely on other international players. And the EU is a very important player. EU has some diplomatic and economic relations with North Korea, and the EU has expressed interest in helping in playing a greater role in resolving the North Korean crisis.
I see.
And also EU played a very important role in the Iranian case. So I think it's very good to help EU's assistance in this case.
I see. Talking about Iranian case, let's invite in our conversation Professor Marandi coming from Iran. Of course, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations has been talking about U.S. possibility to withdraw from that earlier deal with Iran on the nuclear issue. I just wondered, how do you look at those remarks? And at this critical point, how should we understand the psychologies behind these kind of remarks? Professor Marandi.
Well, in Iran, I think the view is that the United States is looking increasingly unreliable. After Iran agreed with the P5+1 over the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, under Obama, the United States violated the agreement repeatedly, such as when it passed and when Obama signed the Iran Sanctions Act, as well as the visa restriction law. But under Trump, the United States has gone even further, such as when we saw the recent sanctions that have been passed by Congress and the Senate and signed by the President. but now this current administration is threatening to go a step forward and to actually withdraw from the agreement. I think it would probably hurt the United States much more than it would hurt Iran, because the international community, many powers, have invested a lot in this agreement, and the U.S. withdrawal would not only isolate the United States, but also I think it would be a sign to other countries that doing deals with the United States is not a very good idea.
I see. Mr. Kimball, help us to understand the internal debate going on in Washington. You are there. We saw you right in front of the White House right now. You know, there are different factors and forces discussing, debating among one another about what to do. And obviously, if Iran deal is, let's just say, partly destroyed, and DPRK already developed its nuclear capabilities as it has already done, what kind of directions are we seeing from the current White House in terms of what to deal with the nuclearization in this region and beyond?
Well, in my view, as an organization that supported the Iran nuclear deal, that supports a solution, a peaceful solution to the North Korea crisis, in our view, it makes very little sense for the Trump administration to take steps that undermine the Iran nuclear deal, especially at a time when we have this urgent crisis on the Korean Peninsula. There is a debate going on here in Washington on Capitol Hill about whether the Trump administration should decertify Iran's compliance with the Iran deal under U.S. law. There are many Republicans who are reluctant to go along with this. If he does this, and it would be in about a month he's got to make this decision, this would put the ball in Congress's court to decide whether to reimpose nuclear-related sanctions on Iran. I think that would be a grave mistake. Iran has met its nuclear-related obligations according to the U.S. intelligence community, according to the IAEA. We need to make sure that Iran continues to cooperate, but this is not a decision that Trump has yet made. It's still being debated here in Washington.
Right. When you look at the realities, the DPRK has already got several things. According to their ambassador, even to the United Nations, they have the hydrogen bomb, they have the nuclear bomb, and they also have the ICBM. That has already become part of the fact. Let's take a look at some of the timelines, how things have been happening, and how the United States has been refusing to see the reality. DPRK already conducted 6 nuclear tests, all of which have been in the same underground site in the DPRK Northeast. The earliest test occurred in 2006 with a yield of 0.5 kilotons. This was followed by a 7 kiloton bomb test in 2009, and 11 kiloton bomb was tested 2013. 2016, DPRK tested a bomb with a yield of 17 kiloton, the equivalent of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in World War II. That bomb tested earlier this month had a yield of 120 kilotons, 8 times the strength of the Hiroshima bomb. Not to mention the ICBM, the length of it that it could reach. So I want to come back to you again, Mr. Kimball. This is a reality now. Okay? This is just something people have to realize. This is the reality. Facing this reality, there are 2 choices. One is to have negotiations and talk. The other is just to look around as if the white elephant in the room is not there. So what's likely to happen? How do you think Washington will be able to streamline its system and come up with something sensible?
Well, I think leaders here in Washington, the American public, really do recognize North Korea's dangerous additional tests.
But what about reaction?
Nuclear and missile progress. Well, as I said, on paper, the United States has an approach that's actually very similar to South Korea's and China's. The problem right now is the coordination of these policies, the orchestration of the diplomacy. As we've just discussed, there is a difference in the way in which this is being implemented and expressed from Washington and Beijing. The key now, and President Xi is important, President Moon Jae-in is very important, Donald Trump is crucial. They need to get their lines straight, their heads together. I think there does need to be some additional sanctions. I don't agree with all the steps the U.S. is proposing, but some additional sanctions are useful. But the key is to provide an offer of direct negotiations with Pyongyang. The United States has to have something to put on the table in exchange for a halt to the North Korean nuclear and missile testing.
Is there something to put on the table, Mr. Kimball, because you've been working on this for decades about this DPRK issue? Is there something from the United States that can be put on the table? What do you think North Korea can be able to put on the table? I'm going to have your view very briefly before I go to the other guests.
Well, I do think that China's basic proposal, the freeze for freeze proposal, is a good place to start. We need to have the United States and South Korea think about modifying those military exercises in ways that make them less threatening to North Korea.
Okay.
North Korea needs to halt its nuclear and missile testing. That's the start.
Mr. Zhao, at this point, we see sanctions earlier being exercised, threatened to be exercised actually toward China and other countries who are dealing with the DPRK in any trade deals coming from the United States, according to President Trump. And then we also see that so far there's only sanctions, at least in public information. We didn't hear anything about possibility of talks, even on the sideline. So Mr. Zhao, will you only exercise as we see the sticks without the carrots? Can things work out? And can China's double suspension proposal, together with Russia, be able to work? Mr. Zhao.
I think if we can learn anything from the Iran nuclear case, the lesson is simply by using sticks wouldn't force the other side to negotiate. At the same time, you have to offer some carrots. In the Iranian case, the U.S. offered to lift some economic sanctions that greatly helped to encourage the Iranians to come to negotiating table. But in the North Korean case, the U.S. hasn't had any idea what it can offer on the table. Rather than doubling down on sanctions, rather than further threatening to cut off the entire crude oil supply to North Korea, I think the U.S. should seriously consider putting some positive inducement in front of North Korea.
Ambiguity, of course, we understand can be a very strategic way of doing things at this point. We understand that. But Professor Marandi, when President Trump saying whether there is going to be any military actions or things like that, he responded, we'll have to see, let's see, something like that. Would that be able to help the international community come up with some kinds of consensus? What is your view given Iran's experiences?
No, I don't think it helps at all. In fact, of course, I have to point out that one key difference between Iran and North Korea is that Iran's nuclear program was always peaceful. The Americans were making allegations. The North Koreans made a nuclear weapon. But the United States repeatedly threatened Iran, but it made no difference. At the end of the day, it was the Americans who sent a message through Oman that we will agree to accept Iran's right to enrich uranium. And after that, the negotiations began. But I think the problem with the United States in general is an issue of credibility. When the United States invades countries like Iraq, destroys the country, when it invades countries like Libya, or it helps to destroy it along with NATO, and when it also helps extremist groups in Syria and so on to overthrow governments, this causes countries like North Korea, I would assume, to be more concerned about their own safety. The regime in North Korea looks at these past experiences, both under Bush and Obama, and they look at the language being used by Trump, and they come to the conclusion that the only way to make sure that the United States does not invade their country or destroy their country is to have that sort of nuclear option. So when the United States makes these sort of threats, I think it creates an incentive for the North Koreans to move more towards military capability. And on the other hand, when we look at the past of the United States, I think it only pushes it further. And when the United States does not abide by international agreements and pulls out of international agreements, whether it's the Iranian nuclear deal or the Paris Accord or anything else, that makes countries, which would include North Korea, be more wary of anything that comes out of Washington.
I see. Mr. Zhao, here's the thing. Now, THAAD system being deployed, 4 more launchers, according to the latest news, additional to the earlier 2. you also see cries in some sectors of the Japanese and the South Korean society talking about we need nuclear weapons too. Are we seeing already an arms race in reality going on in Northeast Asia? And who should be responsible for this if things are getting out of control? China is in the region, United States is out of region, but if there is something going on, nobody is going to be the winner. So here's the thing, what to do now for China? When you look at the situation, you are not the major player because it is United States and DPRK, and yet China in the very middle of it. Mr. Zhao.
Yes, so basically there are two options. One is to use military option to deal with the North Korean crisis once and for all. Second is to talk. But the US has been reluctant to take any option. So it becomes a de facto third option, which is to wait out. Hopefully that time will resolve the crisis in one way or another.
But how?
The fact is,
nobody knows how.
Right, the fact is, if we wait, we only see North Korea developing better capabilities, and that has broader regional implications. So we're already seeing arms race happening, South Korea, Japan taking increasing measures to develop both defensive and offensive military capability, and Russia and China are reacting very strongly. So it is creating a bigger problem among the regional countries. It's harder to maintain stability among the regional countries. I don't think China can do much in resolving this dilemma. I only hope US can be willing to engage with North Korea, because that's really the key to resolve the root cause of the problem.
Okay, before we go, very briefly from you, Mr. Kimball, is this what the United States wants to see? Arms race in Northeast Asia, a North Korea developing nuclear weapon, ICBM, nobody now is being able to contain it. What can the US do? Once again, I want to throw that question to you, very briefly from you, sir.
Well, the United States has an important responsibility because its ally, South Korea, is being directly threatened by the North. But this is a global problem. Let's be careful not to try to shift responsibility to one country. China has an important role to play here, I think a greater role than it has played in the past. Japan and South Korea and China and the United States need to be on the same page to prevent further North Korean developments and an arms race in the region. So I've outlined before what the strategy is, and I would encourage President Xi, President Trump to work better together for that balanced pressure and engagement approach.